The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. Anthony Kennedy announced his retirement from the Supreme Court in June, giving President Trump the opportunity to nominate a second justice to the nation's highest court in just his second year in office. Political partisans take Supreme Court nominees very seriously, but for many Americans, the nomination process flies under the radar. Why is the Supreme Court so important in Americans' lives? How does the nomination and confirmation process work? And what can we expect from the upcoming hearings for Mr. Trump's nominee, Brett Kavanaugh? And do presidents ever regret the individuals they nominate to the court? And if so, why does this happen? Joining me on EconVersations today to discuss why the Supreme Court nominees matter so much is Dr. Allen Mendenhall, Associate Dean of the Thomas Good Jones School of Law at Faulkner University and Director of the Blackstone and Burke Center for Law and Liberty. Welcome back to the show, Allen.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for having me.
So let's get started here. And so the first thing that happened was recently at the end of the Supreme Court's most recent term, Justice Kennedy announced that he was going to step down from the court. So if you could, just start by telling us a little bit about Justice Kennedy's background.
Well, Justice Kennedy's retirement is significant. Justice Kennedy is considered the swing vote. So in a lot of the cases that get decided 5-4, Kennedy is the vote that puts one voting block in the majority or not. And unlike Scalia's vacancy, so when Scalia passed away and President Trump nominated Neil Gorsuch to fill that spot, for both conservatives and liberals, there was sort of an understanding that replacing a Scalia with a Gorsuch was a wash. You were going to replace a Scalia essentially with another person who was like Scalia. Now, Kennedy's position is very different. The stakes are higher because Kennedy's votes were more unpredictable and his opinions were a little more expansive. So replacing Kennedy becomes, it creates a big political charged climate. It creates debate, it creates a lot of fighting, and so that's why we're seeing so much in the news about Brett Kavanaugh's nomination. And
how long has Kennedy been serving on the bench, and who appointed him?
Well, Kennedy was appointed by Reagan, so Kennedy got to the bench after a controversial nomination of Robert Bork. Robert Bork's nomination failed, and after that, Reagan tried to appoint Douglas Ginsburg, and Douglas Ginsburg admitted to drug use, and so his nomination was withdrawn, and that's how we got to Kennedy. That's how Kennedy got there. So Kennedy's path to the Supreme Court in some ways was unusual.
And so recently, President Trump announced his pick for the for this nomination, Brett Kavanaugh. So tell us a little bit about, I guess, possibly soon-to-be Justice Kavanaugh, or we'll see about that.
Well, Kavanaugh spent most of his life in the District of Columbia, in and around the District of Columbia. His mom was a circuit court judge in Maryland. He went to Yale, graduated from Yale, clerked for some legal legends, clerked for Judge Kaczynski, clerked for Judge Anthony Kennedy himself. So he's actually clerked for the man he's been nominated to replace. Interestingly enough, while he was clerking for Justice Kennedy, Justice Gorsuch was also a clerk. So they clerked together. They actually went to the same high school together. Kavanaugh is a couple years older than Gorsuch. But then Kavanaugh spent time working with what is being called the Republican establishment. So he worked in the Bush administration. His wife was secretary to the president. He worked for Ken Starr. He worked on the independent counsel investigation of Bill Clinton in the impeachment hearings and the Vince Foster investigation. He was involved with Bush v. Gore. He was working for George W. Bush when Chief Justice Rehnquist died and was involved in trying to pick a successor. So he has been at the middle of Republican politics for most of his career.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned that Mr. Kavanaugh clerked for the Supreme Court justice. For those who are not in the legal profession, that's actually a very prestigious job.
It's probably the highest honor you could have, short of serving on the court or being some sort of federal appellate judge.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and to get a Supreme Court clerkship, most of the time you have to have clerked for some appellate judge first. And
Mm-hmm.
Kavanaugh himself is what's called a feeder judge. So a lot of his clerks graduate into clerking for the U.S. Supreme Court after they've clerked for him.
And he's been on the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, I think, for more than 10 years.
The D.C.
right?
Circuit, that's
Yes.
right. Yeah, so he was first nominated in 2003. It wasn't until 2006 where he when he was actually confirmed. There was some contentious battle over his nomination. So he's been on the bench since 2006.
Okay, so and I believe he's written a whole bunch of opinions.
Over 300, yeah.
Okay.
In addition to law reviews, and right now we're in the process when everyone is combing through all his records. So even if all his opinions were just 1 page long, that's still 300 pages worth of writing. So in the 1 week and a day, as we sit here today, since his nomination, that's still a lot of reading to go through. Even if you're not going through his law reviews, the emails he wrote when he worked for the president, is a vast paper trail. I mean, I was reading today about how people are going through the records at the Bush Presidential Library and the Clinton Presidential Library, trying to find whatever they can find on Kavanaugh, things he may have written, things he may have said, things he may have done. So the investigatory process is underway.
So we referred to this nomination process, but let's go into a little bit more detail. So what exactly is involved with the nomination process and then the confirmation process? Because I guess we've gone through the nomination part of it.
That's
but
right.
We are about to have the confirmation hearing. So tell us a little bit, just like what the procedure is here.
Yeah. So you mentioned the first step, which is the nomination. The second step is all this investigation that goes on, and these documents that will be presented to the Senate Judiciary Committee, which will hold hearings. So the president nominates, and with the advice and consent of the Senate, then appoints Supreme Court justices. So this has resulted in the Senate confirmation hearings. Actually, the first Senate confirmation hearing was 1925 with Justice Stone, and he sort of offered up this option as, why don't, I know I'm somewhat controversial, why don't I go before the Senate Judiciary Committee and we can air out some things? And that actually helped him to be appointed. But the Senate confirmation hearings have now escalated into a massive political battle. And they're interesting to watch. A lot of times the senators themselves don't know a lot about how the judiciary works and what the role of Supreme Court justice is. So you'll see a lot of senators that just kind of stand up there and grandstand and make speeches and unbeknownst to them, sometimes just make fools of themselves. But one interesting thing about the confirmation hearings that are coming up is that the Republicans have an 11-10 majority on the Senate Judiciary Committee. Now, they had under Gorsuch an 11-9 majority. That all changed with the election of Doug Jones here in Alabama. It changed the dynamics of the Senate Judiciary Committee. So there's actually a little bit tougher time for Republicans to get a nominee through. But what will happen is that the Senate Judiciary Committee will hold all these hearings, and then they will advance the nominee to the full Senate for a vote with a recommendation that's either favorable, unfavorable, neutral. And then the Senate will vote on a confirmation. And if the nominee is confirmed, then the president will then appoint the nominee, and the nominee will no longer be the nominee. The nominee will become the U.S. Supreme Court justice.
Now, there was a change in the rules for the Senate approval of federal justices, and that applied, I think, to the Gorsuch nomination. And so if you could explain this change in the rules and how it changes some of the dynamics.
Sure. Well, I'll back up to 2013. In 2013, the Senate Democrats invoked what is popularly called the nuclear option. Now, the nuclear option refers to a Senate parliamentary rule. So typically, or traditionally, you could filibuster a nominee. And in order for a party to stop that filibuster, they had to have 60 votes to invoke cloture. Now, what the nuclear option does is it eliminates all that. And so it puts the nominee up to a straight majority vote.
Okay.
Right now, the Republicans enjoy a 51-member majority. The Democrats actually have 47, but they're two independent senators, including Bernie Sanders. So that puts it at a 51-49 vote. So everyone is looking at 6 to 8 senators and how they're going to vote, which means there are millions and millions of dollars being spent to sway just a few people on this nomination. Senators to watch would be Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski. These are Republicans who are pro-choice and are considered moderate, so people are wondering how they're going to vote. Claire McCaskill is a Democrat in a red state, but she voted nay on Gorsuch the last time around, is likely to do so again. Joe Manchin is up for re-election in West Virginia, and he's got a tough re-election campaign. He's facing Patrick Morrisey, who was the former Attorney General of West Virginia, sort of a stalwart Republican. And Doug Jones here in Alabama is a big question mark. People are wondering how he's going to vote. I know he's been under scrutiny within the Alabama media, and will he try to be a moderate Democrat, a Dixiecrat as they used to say, or will he try to play to the Democratic base in hopes that Trump will lose the next election and maybe he gets some sort of presidential appointment and can head up some agency under a Democratic administration. So we really don't know how some of these people are going to vote. We don't know what people are going to uncover as they start investigating.
Right.
There are millions and millions of documents probably that have to be combed through. Not all of them will be relevant, but there are millions of documents that have to be combed through to look at Kavanaugh's record. And so we don't know necessarily what's going to control these hearings when the time comes.
So let's get into a little bit more about why the Supreme Court matters so much. And for our lawyers, law professors, or a professor of public choice, many of us know a lot about the details of our third branch of government. But for most of our viewers out there, probably it's the least well understood branch of the government. So when you think of, and especially hard to make sense of, because to the extent that people see any exposure to the judiciary at all, it's usually maybe a judge in a criminal court proceeding or presiding over a trial. But the Supreme Court plays an important role in terms of the structure of our governance. And so if you could just briefly explain to us a little bit, why is it that the Supreme Court so important?
Well, it's the highest court in the land, and so its decisions are very momentous and affect all states and all lower courts. So essentially, all courts are beneath the U.S. Supreme Court. So all its decisions are going to have tentacles that reach widely and touch every state and every jurisdiction. The Supreme Court has gained power over the years. When you think about when the Supreme Court was first established, it's established under the Constitution, but it had no offices of its own, and Marbury and Madison had not been handed down, so we didn't have an established judicial review. When the Jeffersonians tried to impeach Samuel Chase, it was in part on the political grounds that the Supreme Court had amassed too much power. The Supreme Court didn't even get its own building until 1935. But now the Supreme Court is enormously powerful. Its decisions affect everyday life for ordinary Americans and touch upon some of the most divisive issues in the country, things like abortion, things like religious liberty and freedom of speech, and expressions of faith in the public square, things that are that people hold dear, and so it has a very, very big impact.
Now, as a political branch of government, it's also very different in that we've already mentioned that we're going through a nomination and confirmation process as opposed to an election process that we would have for the members of the House of Representatives or the Senate or the President. And then also, Justice Kennedy served on the Supreme Court for more than 30 years, and he never had to be reappointed. So federal judges are appointed for life.
That's right.
Which both of which are very much at odds with our other political positions. So what's sort of like the thinking behind why is it that we need to have these different rules for this, in effect, branch of our government?
Well, that's right. So justices serve for good, as long as they're serving in good behavior, that's been interpreted as a lifetime opinion. And the theory behind that is that the judicial branch ought to be independent from politics, that it ought to be isolated from the political sphere, and that judges ought not to be taking into account everyday politics and shouldn't be accountable to the electoral representatives, because they should, to protect minority rights, they should be unaccountable to the electoral processes. And the theory is essentially that they will have independence.
Now, nominations are very important to the people who follow politics closely. So liberals and conservatives get very worked up about nominations to the Supreme Court. But if you weren't a hardcore liberal or conservative, what might you care about in terms of the qualifications of a Supreme Court member? Or if you were a liberal and you were thinking about these different people President Trump might have nominated, what could you say in terms of like, well, would this person meet some kind of bare qualifications to be a good justice?
Well, people ought to look at a judge's methodology. Too many people think of the Supreme Court as some higher body that waves a magic wand and then poof, here's the law of the land now. But there really are guiding methodologies, guiding hermeneutics that govern how judges rule in cases. So I would say, looking at the judge's methodology, on the right, it's actually interesting, on the right where you have people who are advocating originalism and textualism, well, that doesn't necessarily guarantee conservative results. So that is a discussion of a methodology that sometimes will result in outcomes that conservatives don't like. But it is a methodology that is consistent and can be applied over and over again, and that can influence the legislative branch to pass laws with more clarity, or to pass laws where there's a lack of law, because the idea being it's the legislative prerogative to make laws, and it's the judicial branch's role to interpret the laws that the legislature has already passed.
And then beyond this, there are groups that evaluate or rate justices, and particularly groups that maybe have more of a either liberal or conservative orientation to them. So moving beyond the simple question of is this person qualified, whether they're a liberal or conservative. And one of them that is a group that you're involved with, and it's the Federalist Society. So if you could just tell us a little bit about, from the Federalist Society standpoint, when you're evaluating a judge, what are some of the things you're looking at?
Well, I'll speak just for my own behalf, and not for any organization, but I look to a judge's methodology, and I look to how they approach questions of statutory interpretation, how they look at the different constitutional amendments, how they write their opinions, and that again is not always a results-oriented type analysis. You don't just look at how did this case end up? Do I like the results? Because sometimes you'll like the way the judge reached the results, but you just realize, oh, that was unfortunate. Justice Scalia used to tell the story. He used to say, you know you're a good judge when you go home and you have to say, oh gosh, I hated how I had to rule today, but I just had to rule. And the bad judge goes home and says, I'm so glad I got the opportunity to do the right, to fix this injustice and do the right thing, because the point being that the judge is controlled by the law as written. The law is antecedent to the judge's interpretation of it. The judge doesn't get to make law. The judge just interprets the law that's brought before him in light of the facts before him.
In some of this, I think sounds like it goes back to an idea in the English common law that actually law exists out there in society before government or courts come along, and the judges in the common law were I heard it described as discovering what
so
the law
judges
is.
are actually responsive to the mores and traditions and customs of the community. Now, the ancient common law, or the British common law tradition, is slightly different from our American common law tradition in that the British tradition is very bottom up. Whereas in a constitutional system where you have a written constitution, of course the British had their unwritten constitution handed down through Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights and all these kinds of things. In a constitutional system, that's actually a top-down rather than a bottom-up structure. And the American system also has a scheme of federalism that was not necessarily at play in the British system. So we're still in the process of working out what it means to incorporate the British common law tradition into American system with a top-down constitution that establishes the framework of government for the entire country and that accounts for these 50 different states, all with their own jurisdictions, all competing with one another, all competing with the federal government. You've got all these different inferior federal courts and trying to figure out, what is the interplay between a state Supreme Court and a federal district court, and a state Supreme Court and a federal appellate court. Like who controls what? And this is all still getting worked out. People like to think that there's just a handbook for the legal system and that everything's clear cut. It's not. And in many cases, judges and justices are still trying to figure out what these basic principles of, say, federalism mean in America today.
Now, during the 2016 presidential election campaign, people were looking, some people were analyzing and thinking that one of the most important things that was going to be decided in that campaign was who's going to get control over some of these Supreme Court nominations. Justice Scalia had already passed away. His seat was going to be vacant and filled by the winner of the 2016 election. And there were several other justices, in addition to Justice Kennedy, who has retired, but there's several other justices in excess of 75 years of age, and so might retire during this term in office. But if we look at historically, having the ability to nominate hasn't necessarily always led to presidents picking somebody who they were happy with after the case. There's often been some buyer's regret. So even though like Republicans get to nominate, and if they have a majority in the Senate, have a good chance to confirm their person, that doesn't always work out so well, does it?
That's correct. I mean, Roosevelt was upset when he nominated Holmes. Eisenhower nominated William Brennan and Earl Warren, who were some of the most liberal justices to serve on the court. Nixon nominated Blackmun, who was the author of Roe v. Wade. Gerald Ford nominated John Paul Stevens, who was a member of the left wing of the court, who is now advocating for a repeal of the Second Amendment. There are people that say John Roberts was a mistake for George W. Bush. And of course, Reagan nominated Kennedy, who ended up not being what everyone expected. And then George H.W. Bush nominated Sutter. So there are many, many examples of justices sort of turning out differently from presidential expectation.
Now, how does that end up happening? Because you think presumably if you were President Nixon, you would at least if you yourself didn't sit down and look at somebody, you would have people around you who would vet these potential nominees for you, and it'd be in your interest to make sure you pick somebody you were going to be happy with. But how does this end up?
Well, I just think historically the vetting process wasn't as sophisticated as it is today.
Okay.
Now you have so many public interest groups digging through every conceivable record, and technology has enabled us to go find a lot of stuff that we couldn't find in the past. And I think that given these mistakes that presidents have made, or these regrets at least, that presidents have experienced, these presidents today and all these public interest groups are now working very hard to make sure that doesn't happen again. And so the process has just changed. There's just a lot more oversight. There's a lot more scrutiny than there used to be. That's why we had a list. I mean, John Malcolm at the Heritage Foundation, Leonard Leo at the Federalist Society, and others working together to come up with a list of acceptable nominees to the High Court. And of course, the list changed. Kavanaugh wasn't even on the original list, and then they added 5 new names, and Kavanaugh was one of the 5. But this is sort of new. I mean, it wasn't that presidents didn't have lists; they had private lists. But having a big public list that everybody can scrutinize, including everyday people in their home state, just ordinary people like me, can go and look and say, "Wait, they've got him on the list. Well, let me call my senator and talk about this experience I had with this person." So it just helps the vetting process. It's become more sophisticated over time.
Because there would also be some question, some issue in terms of how well people have staked out their opinions. In the case of Justice Kavanaugh, I mean, as you mentioned, I think he's written over 300 opinions since he's been on the appellate court. And so he's had a pretty good opportunity to say what he thinks. And is that something that factors in here? And
it is.
And would it be important to wait and nominate somebody when they're older so you have a better sense of where they're really at?
Well, 2 things. I think that presidents prefer to nominate someone younger so that they have an influence on the court longer. Justice Gorsuch was young. He was in his 40s when he was nominated. He's now in his 50s, but and Cavanaugh's 53. But the idea is that if they serve in the court for decades, they have a long period of time to influence the trajectory of the law. But that said, there's a desire to pick people who are sitting judges because they do have a record. You can analyze their opinions for how they rule. You can determine whether they actually employ the methodology that they say they adhere to. And that's one reason why you see the list full of people who are sitting judges. That's also the reason why you see younger and younger nominees to lower courts, lower federal courts, both circuit courts and district courts, is because they, the conservatives and the liberals or whoever it may be want to sort of cultivate a jurisprudence or gain a record for these people who might one day be great Supreme Court nominees.
Now, there's another element of law in how judges actually decide cases that I think is relevant here and might explain sometimes why a judge that is picked because you thought they were going to rule on commerce cases in a certain way or federalism cases in a certain way end up deciding differently. And that is judges make decisions on cases, and those cases have facts. And then also the Supreme Court's an appellate jurisdiction, so they have their hands by it. So if you could just a little bit tell us a little bit about this, why are the facts of the case so relevant?
Well, the facts of the case really determine what laws apply and how those laws apply. Our judicial system is made to deal with concrete cases and actual complex problems. We don't have a Supreme Court that consists of 9 philosophers who can just speculate about abstract theory and debate that kind of thing. It's actually a system that's very pragmatic and that it responds to actual problems and felt needs, and questions come up through the appellate system have to get framed in a certain way. Issues do or don't get preserved for appellate review depending on how lawyers argued cases. So it's a complex process. By the time cases are brought to the Supreme Court, which the Supreme Court basically has discretionary jurisdiction, doesn't even have to take cases. So even the petitioning the court for review is a process. And so a lot of people don't fully understand that the Supreme Court is very cabined by the way a case comes to them, and they don't get to carve out infinite space in which to impose whatever personal views they may have.
And the facts of the case might dictate that they rule differently than perhaps their opinion would naturally incline them. Well, thanks very much for coming on and talk about this. I enjoyed it very much. And thanks for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.